I'm Dr. Daniel Cross Turner, and I'm head of programming and outreach for the Georgetown County Library System. Welcome to the library series of online programming celebrating South Carolina's deep and diverse food traditions, entitled From Blue Hills to Green Sea, representing South Carolina foodways. These programs are generously sponsored by South Carolina Humanities, as well as our friends of the Georgetown Library and friends of the Waccamaw Library. And we have a range of experts in foodways for you who are going to take us on a culinary venture all the way from the Blue Hills, the Piedmont area, the upcountry or upstate of South Carolina, the Dark Corner, all the way down to the beautiful shoreline here, the coastal plain, and the low country. And we're going to look at all these different food dishes and food preparation and traditions of sharing food and drink as well across our state and across its history. All right, and today we have an excellent presenter coming to us, kind of taking us to the shadow of the Blue Ridge, and it's Dr. Jessica Martell, and she's going to explore the recent resurgence of moonshine and whiskey distilleries in upstate South Carolina, the Blue Hills, an area historically represented as the Dark Corner of the state. Her talk is called Moonshine in South Carolina's Dark Corner, Whiskey's Trendy Resurgence. Unlike the more rarefied experiences created by vineyards and microbreweries, whiskey's checkered associations make it a troublesome, fascinating, and often contradictory commodity. Drawing on the history of distilling, Dr. Martell will discuss the importance of narrative, a central feature of literary analysis, for promoting these unusual heritage drinkways in today's foodie marketplace. Dr. Martell is Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Appalachian State University up in Boone, and author of the scholarly book Farm to Form, Modernist Literature and Ecologies of Food from 2020, and co-editor of the essay collection Modernism and Food Studies from 2019. So she's had a busy couple of years. Dr. Jessica Martell also serves on the board of Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture. And Jessica grew up in part in upstate South Carolina, in that Dark Corner, the Greenville area, or I guess just a little further down the road from the Dark Corner. She is also Dr. Zachary Vernon's equal half, his editor-in-chief for life, and Dr. Vernon will be joining us as well for a talk. So this is Dr. Jessica Martell, Moonshine in South Carolina's Dark Corner, Whiskey's Trendy Resurgence. Enjoy.
Well, hello, my name is Jessica Martell, and I am a professor at Appalachian State University up in Boone, North Carolina, although I was also partially brought up in Greenville, South Carolina as well. I want to thank Dan Turner for inviting me to participate and really just commend him for an incredibly impressive program that he's put together for this symposium. I'm really honored to participate with everyone today. My research interests include British and Irish history and culture, literature, and food studies. I'm also the chair of the board of directors of an organization called Blue Ridge Women in Agriculture, a nonprofit that helps advocate for farmers, expand their markets, and provide access to everyone in the high country community who needs access to fresh, healthy, local food. Now, in my last book, I wrote about meat and milk, produce, mushrooms, and potatoes. But recently, I've become curious about what people drink too. And one reason trend has given me plenty to think about, especially since I moved to Appalachia about 6 years ago. Does your local liquor store have a section that looks like this? It seems to me that the moonshine section, at least up here in Boone, expands every time I walk through the door. Now, unlike gin or bourbon, selling moonshine seems like a challenge to me because it's such a specific taste, but it's quickly become big business, as you can see evidence from a very simple Google image search here. Similar growth can be traced in craft beer, vineyard tourism, and the popularity of craft cocktails. And now, thanks in part to reality TV shows like Mountain Men and Moonshiners, moonshine seems to have come out of the hollers and into the mainstream, selling itself as, in the words of one scholar, as craft as much as a crime. In the last 10 years, consumer interest in moonshine has caught the interest of legal alcohol manufacturers. And by 2017, at least 137 craft distilleries had opened, many of them in Appalachia, the region with which moonshine is particularly entwined in the public imagination. And that, of course, includes upstate South Carolina that I'm going to talk about today. Smaller distilleries have sold millions of cases since 2010, and corporate liquor brands have followed suit, such as Jack Daniel's Clear Tennessee Rye and Jim Beam's Ghost White Whiskey. But the stories of some of these distilleries and companies tell about the revitalization of moonshine are worth examining more closely. While some distillers reconnecting with their heritage are trying to bring moonshine into the 21st century, others are still struggling to break free from simplistic and outdated representations of mountain regions and peoples. Now, this year, I've noticed that Americans have become more critical about how non-mainstream groups are being portrayed by food and drink advertisers. The removals of Aunt Jemima and Mia, the Indigenous woman on the Land O'Lakes butter packaging, demonstrate the fact that Americans seem to be taking a hard look at the everyday accoutrement in their pantries and finding some of these branding strategies unpalatable. Excuse me, these demands aren't just frivolous. Asking companies to stop reducing Indigenous peoples to mascots or challenging these companies' use of demeaning stereotypes to make a profit are actions that indicate some important cultural progress in my eyes. So in that spirit, I think it's fitting to look at the recent popularity of moonshine, a product with a complicated but colorful history that can nevertheless be often commodified and reduced in problematic ways. So today, the flow of my talk is going to be this. I'm going to discuss the history of whiskey marketing. I'm going to look at moonshining in the dark corner in upstate South Carolina in particular. And then finally, I'm going to reflect on why it's important for moonshine as an industry to move beyond stereotypes as distillers and companies revitalize this fascinating craft. So first, I want to begin by looking at the bifurcation, and all I mean is the very high-low split that we see so often in today's whiskey culture. On the one hand, the rarefied, thoroughbred, dotted bourbon trails of the bluegrass, and on the other, the rebellious, rip-roaring moonshine distilleries that have been popping up all over, especially in the Carolinas and Tennessee lately. Two Southern stereotypes are alive and well on my ABC store shelves: the Southern gentleman Jack and the NASCAR-loving hillbilly. But these two stereotypes actually have a longer history than many people realize. US whiskey ways have been imported from the British Isles, and so the history of British drinkways tells us a little bit about their origins, which can be traced back to the politics of the British Empire. So I'm going to start just briefly in what is now known as Northern Ireland. I think many people don't know that it was considered a laboratory for the first settler plantations that we maybe in the US South might recognize as such. But who are the Scots-Irish who came to the US in such great numbers and are such a central fixture of white heritage in Appalachia in the South? Well, they're descendants of a group of Scottish Presbyterians who, in the 17th century, were forcibly resettled from Scotland to the north of Ireland in the northern 6 counties, predominantly, by the English as a way for the English to put down rebellions in both places, in Scotland and Ireland. Both of these locations were, experiencing a lot of uprising against British colonial rule, and so resettlement was one of their solutions to try and subdue all of the social unrest. So with military support, loyalist settlers were given land that was stolen from native Irish inhabitants to run brutal plantations. This is a system that institutionalized the ethnic, religious, and political differences that would eventually erupt in the violent conflicts of the Troubles later in the 20th century. Part of the effort to get the Irish in line with all these changes was to punish Irish drinking, enforcing bans and high taxes by martial law and even executions. So illegal production, as you can imagine, boomed. Now, in this slide, I've kind of created a word cloud from all of my readings and research about Irish whiskey ways that I think is sort of evocative of what the ethos of this tradition is. That Irish whiskey is kind of a whiskey that is young whiskey, it's unaged whiskey, it's secret whiskey, it's illicit whiskey, and it's kind of brash and fast and young and dangerous. So many Scots-Irish left the arrangement in Northern Ireland behind and emigrated to the US, especially in the 18th century. They brought their stills and their recipes for Pickin, which is the Gaelic word for what we now know of as moonshine. Pickin was always made secretly to prevent the agents of the crown and later revenuers and taxmen, when they come over to the States, from collecting their duties. These immigrants are often associated with the frontier spirit of rugged individualism, insular and clannish family arrangements, and certain kinds of suspicion of authority. So as these groups migrated across the ocean to Pennsylvania and down the spine of the Appalachians into the South, they fomented these familiar tropes of secrecy, danger, and rebelliousness that appear so often in moonshine marketing today. And I should just quickly clarify that the definitions of moonshine vary, but for strict purists, moonshine really refers to any alcohol upon which no revenues have been paid. And so your next thought is, well, that rules out all of the legal stuff in the liquor store, and that's true. So another way of thinking about moonshine is as white whiskey or clear whiskey, its base color, because it is unaged. And it's also usually defined by very high proof compared to other kinds of whiskey. Its usefulness and brashness and the intensity of its taste really distinguishes it most clearly from bourbon, the other kind of famous American whiskey that I want to talk about, because apart from taste and color, bourbon has an entirely different ethos as well that's worth mentioning. Bourbon style whiskey follows a really different cultural migration path across the ocean from the UK to the US. Unlike moonshine, bourbon is aged, and aged whiskey has to settle and sit. The longer, the better. In other words, no NASCAR runs down Thunder Road for bourbon makers. Its production ethos is really dedicated to maturity, I think literally and figuratively, and that's given bourbon a more grown-up, upscale image. Now, the most famous aged whiskeys, arguably, come from Scotland. So it should come as no surprise that a lot of bourbon marketing techniques take their cue from earlier Scottish ad campaigns. And again, we're going back to the 19th century here, because Queen Victoria is probably the figure who made Scottish whiskey into the famous brand that it is today. And I've made another sort of word cloud of associations that when I read about Scottish whiskey, these are some of the terms that I really associate with it. It's this kind of place-based, like earthen. There's lots of talk about peat and earth and terroir and wood, the barrels that it's aged in. This is a very kind of traditional, staid, stoic, and regal product. And the reason why these words exist and why we have these associations with them is because of the Queen. In the late 19th century, Victoria loved her Scottish Highlander military regiments who were shipped out all over the world to defend her empire, for good and for ill. And according to Kingsley Amis in his book, Everyday Drinking, Victoria was a huge fan of Scottish whiskey. And in turn, Scottish distillers decided to market their regional delicacy as a global luxury in honor of their Queen. So these aggressive marketing campaigns reinforced Scottish whiskey as a gentleman's drink, something that persons of taste and distinction consumed. Yet these promotions also used ideal depictions of Scottish life that verge on caricature. And here are some advertisements of Dewar's, which is one of the most famous kind of blended Scottish whiskeys that sort of are from the late Victorian era. These caricatures include kilted Scots hunting stags, playing golf, fly fishing, and carrying bagpipes. Dewar began advertising his blended whiskey in 1883 with a bagpipe player dressed in a kilt, as you can see here. This practice continues today. This is one fun little rabbit hole that I went down for a while, looking at the earliest whiskey advertisements. And one of the first cinematic advertisements ever made in 1898 was for Dewar's whiskey. And I have a screenshot grabbed here. I'm not technologically savvy enough to actually play it, but you can Google Dewar's 1898 on YouTube and just see about 45 seconds of these four men dancing in kilts to advertise Dewar's whiskey. So contemporary marketing borrows traits from one or the other of these traditions. The young, scrappy, rebellious spirits from Ireland, or the noble, aged mountain highland tipple from Scotland. And I think it's worth mentioning that both these stereotypes are grounded in the power dynamics of empire. I say this because to some degree, both of those images and those kinds of images that are associated with those whiskey traditions really increased Britain's cultural power at the time, whether giving the Victorians a luxury brand to export as a beacon of civilization, or giving them the chance to demonize a colonial subculture in order to justify their subjugation. But what does all this history have to do with South Carolina, you're probably asking? Well, two things. One, it introduces us to the power dynamics that define whiskey ways for much of US history. And I think more importantly for my talk, it helps explain why cultural stereotypes around bourbon and moonshine feel so deep-rooted and immovable, because some of them are actually hundreds of years old. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we turn to the narrative of whiskey as it migrates down into the South. And then we also sort of look at the ways in which moonshine distilleries are marketing themselves today in our current resurgence. So in South Carolina, among other places in the South and Appalachia, the Scots-Irish tradition has fueled and shaped public perception of moonshine whiskey. Now, federal alcohol taxes, it should be said, were seldom levied or collected until after the Civil War, when the US government needed to pay for Reconstruction. So up until then, rural households always made a little bit of alcohol for personal use or an additional revenue stream in tough times. So post-Civil War, taxes drove a lot of small-scale production underground. But I want to kind of flash forward a little bit to the era of Prohibition, especially the 1920s, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was banned the production, sale, and consumption of alcoholic beverages, because I think this is the time in which myth-making about moonshining and bootleggers really takes off. And you can see a lot of this sort of myth-making in contemporary marketing today. Now, for this presentation, I really enjoyed digging into the history of Greenville during Prohibition. I didn't know very much about it, even though I grew up there for part of my life. It was still pretty rural in the 20s, and it was described by one historian as a small city stuck between Possum Kingdom in the south and the Dark Corner in the north. And the Dark Corner is a 19th century nickname for the very, very northern parts, and particularly northeastern part of Greenville County, which is when you get up into the mountains up on Highway 25 and kind of crossing the state line into North Carolina. Excuse me. So the 20s was a decade of transformation, and Greenville's story sounds like a lot of other places during this decade. Cotton prices had plummeted after the First World War, and in the textile mills of the upstate, falling prices led to dramatic restructuring in both machinery and management. So it's a time of kind of labor activism and strikes, because workers were responding to what they called the Great Stretch Out, when mills sort of automated and then accelerated their production lines and laid a lot of people off. So there's lots of unrest, police, clashes with police, and talk of keeping communists out. Urbanization is really growing, and so does the urban financial sector. And so this is when Greenville really sees a marked expansion of a prosperous white business elite. It also is worth noting that historians, discuss a thriving, if smaller, prosperous Black middle class that were really dedicated to uplifting their own communities, perhaps to protect against, but also in response to a climate of growing segregation. During this decade, parks were planted, highways were constructed, planes took off from the airport. I think it was called the Jetport at the time, and the first local radio station was applied for. So in some ways, this busy history of Greenville seems to exist apart from accounts of the Dark Corner. And yet these two places really dovetail together in really important ways. Remaining sparsely populated well into the 20th century, the Dark Corner was home to generations of subsistence farmers who gained a reputation down in the county seat of Greenville for being poor, uneducated, prone to violence, and fiercely independent. Antebellum households in the Dark Corner actually largely stayed out of the Civil War, and its little kind of hills and hollers were provided a haven for a lot of Confederate deserters. And then later on, especially during Prohibition, countless illegal whiskey stills and distilleries. For many cash-strapped mountaineers, the financial rewards of making untaxed moonshine far outweighed the risks of detection by federal agents. In one historian's account, a Dark Corner moonshiner could make 3 gallons of corn whiskey from a bushel of corn and sell it for $1 to $2 per gallon instead of 60 cents for the original bushel. So really there was a big financial incentive for people to take risks and continue this craft. One hauler of note in the Dark Corner actually contained as many as 20 distilleries within 2 miles. So it seems like a really competitive atmosphere. And it's definitely been recorded that Dark Corner whiskey was sold all along the state line, up and down, and also down into the upstate's urban centers like Spartanburg and Greenville. So I think we can imagine Dark Corner distillers running their wares down the mountain to Greenville's bustling, kind of increasingly prosperous scene. and also perhaps clashing with Greenville police, since revenue officers were also, always pulling aside transit wagons on their way to market. Urbanization, the story of Greenville's growing success during the decades, really eventually opened up the dark corner as people moved to town for education and diversifying opportunities for employment. Yet I think perhaps because of its long isolation and sparse contact, the area retained a bit of mystique that I think you can still see today. And I think some moonshine distillers in the upstate are still sort of, using this as part of their image. As Dark Corner native Dean Campbell writes, visitors to the area, upon asking where the Dark Corner was located, were told by locals that it was a little further up the road. In other words, no one wanted to admit that they actually lived there. I think a lot of remote places, especially in the US Mountain South, can be prone to such myth making, but also so misunderstood by and misunderstandings fueled by really harmful stereotypical representations that continue to linger in both the state's imagination as well as the larger country. So I think my question remains, like, who really were these mysterious bootleggers and shiners? I mean, really? And so I bet if everyone has a mental picture of one, and if I just stop for a minute and give you a chance to kind of picture a bootlegger in your head, what does it look like? I bet it's a hillbilly. And so I spent some time collecting, just sort of doing a Google image search for bootlegger and moonshine and moonshiners. And this is really by far the kind of most common image that comes up. In the middle, actually, you see Popcorn Sutton, who's one of the most famous kind of modern moonshiners. That was sort of his story was featured on Moonshiners, the Discovery Channel reality show. And you can see he really sort of inhabits and embodies that kind of hillbilly stereotypes from years past. He really sort of brings it to life with his own kind of aesthetic choices. So the hillbilly, I'll talk about that in just a second as a kind of caricature and an image, but I just want to say that I spent some time collecting, sort of seeing how many hillbillies I could find from moonshine distilleries' websites. And there's lots of them. So I've given you an assortment here to look at while I'm talking, from mostly merchandise that use the hillbilly image in distilleries in South Carolina and in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Now, scholars have long criticized offensive portrayals of Appalachian people that pop culture fixtures like from the Beverly Hillbillies to MTV's Buck Wild have perpetuated, especially the caricature of the hillbilly, who's usually given traits like ignorance, laziness, wildness, moonshining, feuds, and bare feet. Now, these stereotypes are really, it should be said, often created by outsiders for outsiders. As scholar Chad Berry writes, the consistent aim to attract a non-Appalachian audience by reinforcing stereotypes of Appalachia make the audience, main aim is to attract a non-Appalachian audience by reinforcing these stereotypes, making the urban audience feel better about itself, more orderly, more ambitious, more sophisticated, and more cosmopolitan. And stereotypes like these are important to call out and actually challenge because they have really dangerous real-world consequences. I'm really lucky to work at Appalachian State with my colleague, Catherine Ledford, who argues that negative descriptions of mountain people have also been used to reinforce their unsuitability to own or occupy land, especially with valuable minerals and resources below the surface. Once Appalachian people are characterized as undeserving or lazy, it becomes much easier to question their claims to the land, and then that makes the land more available for capitalist ventures. And she's talking more in the context of energy policy in the region, but I think that this sort of really applies more generally. It's much easier to kind of victimize people when you think that they are not as worthy or as human as you are. Now, recent projects like the documentary Hillbilly, which you can see on Netflix if you're interested, it's really good, seek to open the public's eyes to the real communities behind these images and stereotypes. And yet the hillbilly and the redneck kind of remain firmly entrenched in the public's mind when it comes to Appalachia, and especially when it comes to moonshining. And while some distillers have deliberately refused to traffic in these kinds of images, others are still kind of falling back on them to sell their products, as you can see here, from moonshine being redneck fuel in the red t-shirt, the Sugarlands t-shirt on the sort of bottom left-hand corner, I hope you can see that, is like a drunk bear and a hillbilly. And then hillbilly images are used to sell these pickles. So I think it's really worth asking why there seems to be a struggle to give up these images if they're so harmful. And I think Sugarland's distillery in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, kind of gives an illustration of what I just described. That this is an example of a corporate cross-marketing venture. You can see that they are cooperating with the Discovery Series moonshiners to kind of sell both TV and whiskey and their merchandise, and NASCAR as well, as you can see there. That this kind of cross-marketing uses stereotypes to sell products to tourists and outsiders. You can have a good laugh, buy a jar of dangerous liquor and leave without learning about the region or knowing anything about the local community or its rich history, and particularly the history behind this production. Other examples seem more complex and are worth investigating. I might have to flip back and forth here, but I'm not sure what's entirely going on here. And I would need more investigation, I think, to really be more certain. But one of the things I think is interesting is if you look at the Palmetto Distillery merchandise and the Copperhead Mountain merchandise there, look at actually the ways in which their bottles and even their distilleries themselves choose a really different aesthetic. It's kind of fascinating to me, and it's a really jarring juxtaposition if you really think about it. On the one hand, like their bottles and their buildings say, like the statement that they're giving off here in these images is that we're serious, like this is a craft. And we're craftspeople. But the t-shirts that they used to sell and the pickles on the way, in the gift shop on the way out kind of suggest that the whole thing is a joke. And to me, these two things don't make sense together. It either is a kind of serious craft or it's not. And I think for me, it's a branding problem that really needs some ironing out. But I don't want to sit here and critique too much. But I do think that there's something interesting that's happening here in this kind of uneven aesthetics and this sort of incongruities in some of these distilleries' products that they push out, because it might speak to the broader challenges of trying to adapt moonshine for a mainstream consumer, namely balancing the adventurous elements of its kind of quirky past with the refinement of the craft that sort of, brings it into the hipster, world that we, consume in. So I guess the thing that I would say maybe that strikes me the most after looking at some of these websites is that it feels like some of these stories are still being written and that some of them maybe need a few more drafts before they really figure it out. But there's another really interesting question that I think what I like a lot about this resurgence in moonshine is that it's really changing the face of moonshiners. And so that, as a researcher, I kind of went back to my research and said, well, I mean, if more distilleries are open and the faces of moonshining are becoming more diverse now, weren't there always lots of different people making their own liquor in their backyards, like even back in the 1920s? And the answer is always, of course. Like any other occupation or social role or historical question, the past is never just composed of only white men with long beards. And so this is where my future whiskey research lies, looking for records and stories from communities who've really been overlooked so far in the stories about moonshining, but who have taken the Scots-Irish whiskey tradition in particular and have made it their own. So recently, more attention is being paid to the histories of diverse communities and their stories. This is great because their stories really provide a rich new understanding, in this case, of what bootlegging and moonshining actually might have looked like in these earlier heydays. So, for example, the Dark Corner is a more racially mixed region than many people might even know or think. And the 2008 book, Liberia, South Carolina, from UNC Press provides this great oral history of a close-knit African-American community just across the Greenville County line into northern Pickens County. So very much the same area as the Dark Corner. And in this community, moonshining was also a common practice. One Liberia resident remembered quote, a relative sprouting corn, grinding the sprouts in a meat grinder, and carrying the material out into the woods to be fermented and then distilled into alcohol. And other residents talk about moonshining as necessary to put food on the table and how difficult it was to weigh the risks versus the benefits, especially in lean times. What I also like about this study is that women are discussed as actually being moonshiners as well. And that is really kind of a relief to me because in most histories and accounts of moonshine that I've read, women are usually relegated to the backdrop or they're just there as like, temperance crusaders and fanatics. And, I always felt like in my heart, I suspected that they were participating and were just as smart and entrepreneurial and resourceful as all the male figures that have been discussed and interviewed in oral histories. So examples that diversify our understanding of moonshine as an entrepreneurial endeavor, I think really testify to the presence of otherwise invisible communities. And I think for Liberia, South Carolina, particularly Black communities in Appalachia, which as a region tends to be pretty whitewashed in our national understanding. Now, I'm aware that I'm talking with a Georgetown audience today, and there's also a couple of really interesting low country examples I wanted to bring up that build my case that moonshining is a much more expansive practice than I think is really commonly understood. I recently came across journalist and author Herb Fraser's book, Behind God's Back, chronicling the flourishing moonshine businesses among coastal Gullah communities in the 1920s and 30s especially. This book really revealed, I think, a set of daring Black entrepreneurial practices in the era, which is really fun to read about. I recommend grabbing it. And just as in upstate communities, moonshining in Gullah communities brought a source of much needed income and stability for these families who were also then sort of weighing very similar issues to what people who were interviewed in the Dark Corner talked about, namely, weighing the pros and cons of financial stability versus, the risks of jail time. Now, these stories I love when stories kind of coexist together and really give you a new sense of the past because you haven't put them together yet. I don't know how many of you saw a few weeks ago, especially if you live in the low country of South Carolina, that there's a really exciting archaeological discovery, which is the picture in the lower right-hand side of the slide. An alleged still owned by Al Capone's business partner was discovered in Hell Hole Swamp. And that's in the Francis Marion National Forest, about 30 miles north of Charleston in Berkeley County. And Berkeley County apparently was infamous nationwide as a hotbed of illicit distilling, with most of it being loaded onto trains and shipped to Capone's clubs in Chicago. So the Dark Corner really wasn't the only dark corner in South Carolina during Prohibition. In 1929, in fact, the pro-temperance governor, John G. Richard, declared Berkeley a festering sore in the state because of its connections to clubs and the jazz age, in big urban centers elsewhere in the country. So I love the fact that Al Capone's tankards of moonshine is just chugging out of Hellhole Swamp on these secret timber railway lines. And just down the road, Gullah communities are brewing their own livelihoods and supporting the flourishing of their culture kind of at the same time. None of these stories, especially these two, let's say on the slide, are collected in the same place. And I think there are so many good arguments to be made about bringing these disparate stories together that are happening simultaneously. And it's important for us to do that, especially when we talk about food and drinkways. And that's why symposia like this are so important. We really gain, in my opinion, a richer understanding of the nuances of history and tradition when multiple stories are told in the same sitting. So in conclusion, I hope I've demonstrated today that when you dig down beneath all the advertising gimmicks, moonshine actually has a really complicated, interesting, and unique history that can really capture the imagination with lessons and insight that don't just entertain, but also educate. And I also hope that, you leave this thinking there's a lot more to discover as well. You thought you knew something, but actually when you really dig down into it, there's a lot more to learn. I think if Americans have become more critical of businesses that turn a profit by reducing subcultures to derogatory stereotypes, I think some distilleries are going to have to, really participate in the revitalization of their craft in a different way. They're going to have to, I think, probably start finding themselves meeting the demands of consumers who seek out products with more honest, but also much more deeply human stories behind them. Well, thanks very much for letting me talk today, and I really look forward to your questions.